a wood duck. Okay, we apologize for not having our original speaker tonight. Ellie English is sick and cannot make it. So Mountain Man, Bill Sublet, decided to come here. And he's going to tell us a little about it. Doug is. I was originally planning to do this in November when these clothes wouldn't have been so hot. You'd have all been cold, but that's all right. These are suited for 10,000 feet in the mountains of Wyoming in the fall and spring, and not Arizona in the summer. Anyway, I was originally going to do this as a personification of Bill Sublet, but I'm still trying to learn Mountain Man. I can see which way the stick floats. I don't care if it's a plug or plug. I'm going back to the mountains, shining mountains for sure. And I'll give it to him up to the Green River. But in any event, I picked Bill Sublet because Bill, among other things, was a businessman. He ended up in the end in banking, believe it or not, in St. Louis. He was on the State Banking Commission. Bill ran the business end. He was a mountain man. And how many of you know what it means to be a mountain man? Well, okay, go on ahead, Lisa.
Mostly fur trapping and trade with
Okay, fur trapping and trading with the Indians, and the defining factor was that you stayed a winter in the mountains. That made you a mountain man. And I'm going to strip some of this off slowly. This is my .50 caliber Plains rifle. It's shorter than the Kentucky rifles. And it is a rifled barrel. It's caplock instead of flintlock. And the caplocks were just coming in during the Mountain Man era. And the Plains rifle, mountain rifle, was shorter than the Eastern rifles, which made it more convenient to use from horseback. Excuse me, get down from there right now. Did you see the sign? Pardon.
There is no signs up.
The signs came down? My apologies.
The city didn't put the signs back up.
The city considers the balcony very dangerous. Okay, so I brought my flintlock as well. I brought my flintlock as well. And I'll talk about these a bit more in a while. I've got to take some of this off. You know, you got one shot each with those. And what did you do after that? Well, that's when you had your hawk, which was never unloaded. So, excuse me if you have no idea. You're getting hot too, yeah. My possibles bag, that contains everything I might possibly need. Flints, fire-making kit, and I might have bullets in there. That would be just round lead bullets. So, with that. And that feels so much better. Okay, let's take a look at the screen up here. Bill Sublette, let's go on to the next one. I don't have a clicker. Do you have a clicker for me? Don't have a clicker for me. Okay. I start my story with Henry Hudson. Henry sailed up the Hudson River, which, by the way, is not really a river. It's an estuary. It's tidal all the way to Albany, if you've got any idea how far that is. Made it very difficult to sail up. Had to go with the tides and then anchor and go with the tide. And he traded with the Indians along the way. He was an Englishman, but he was working for the Dutch. And he established the New Amsterdam colony. And the Dutch began trading with the Indians. And one of the things they were trading for was beaver. They basically cleaned out the East Coast. And then, of course, New Amsterdam became New York. And if we could have the next one. And there it is. And the fur trade moved across the continent. The fur trade led the advance. Daniel Boone was a long hunter. You think he was going out and shooting meat for the family, waiting 6 months to bring it home? No. He was after beaver and other peltries. And that's what led us into Kentucky, led us over the mountains. And the other thing it did for us is the Indians that were there, they continued moving westward and trapping. And during the Mountain Man era, we have groups of mountain men known as Canarsie and Rockaway Indians, who are part of the Delaware tribe. And anybody know where Canarsie is? It's in Brooklyn. How about Rockaway? It's Long Island. Yeah, it's a part of Queens, but it's across Brooklyn from Queens. Go figure. In any event, these guys kept their identity and kept moving west and became the mountain men, and they taught everybody how to hunt beaver. Let's go on to the next one. There we go. If you read the works of the Hansons, you'll find that they believed that virtually all the Indian wars before our Revolutionary War and all the European wars fought on the continent were led off by the fur trade. What we have here in blue is the French, and in red the English, and in yellow you can hardly see the Spanish, trying to outflank each other with trading posts for the fur trade. And why is the fur trade important? Well, obviously, back in 1605, everybody wanted a beaver hat, right? I don't think so. They did want beaver. And I wrote this for children and originally, and I've added to it significantly. With the kids, I have to ask a lot of questions to make sure they understand and to try and get them to imagine the world 200 years ago. Because that's what we're talking. The Mountain Man era begins in 1823. And why? Because a style change brought hats into vogue? No, not hardly. I'll get to what caused it. But I want you to think back to that world. How do you get a kid 6 years old to understand 200 years ago? Once he's taken off his shoes, he can only get to 20. Okay, never mind.
We got it.
No, I know, you get to 21, but you're different. Yeah. Imagine if we were doing what they were doing in the 19th century and we were still burning wood for heat, not this summer, and for cooking, we'd be choking to death on all the smoke. We stripped this whole area of wood in the 1880s. That's one of the reasons why the old pictures of Tombstone and the surrounding area looks like there's nothing here but grass. And you also, if you were back in those days, you'd have known what good wood was good for flooring, what was good for furniture, what was good for an axe handle. Different kinds and types of woods had different uses. And since World War II, we have forgotten this. We are now using synthetic fibers of all kinds. You go out and buy a nylon-handled hammer with a rubber grip. But when I was a kid, there's still wooden handles. We've lost sight of that. Refrigeration and new fibers, petrochemicals, and the fact that we've really opened up the mines and we have all kinds of metal products. We have changed the world from what was there. Not just wood, hide. How many of you are wearing cowhide tonight? Okay, a couple of you. Used to be shoes, belts, and all kinds of belts and other things. And buffalo hide? Yeah, sure, all them rich guys on the East Coast who worked in the universities and wrote the books, they thought that the only thing you could use a buffalo hide for was in your sleigh in the winter as a lap blanket. How many of you have a sleigh? Yeah. No, what did we want buffalo hide for? Buffalo hide was made into coats, heavy winter blankets, gloves. But more than anything, we wanted buffalo hide because it was thick and tough, and it made the belts that drove the Industrial Revolution. We were still using some of those belts in the 1950s. That's how good they were. And hides, I didn't mention California. California had lots of cows, no refrigeration. Once we started trading, the Yankee clipper ships going around the Horn, trading with California, what did they do? They killed off cows and gave us nothing but the hides. We needed the leather. And felt for hats. Wool and cotton, which are woven fabrics, but there are some animals that have an undercoat that is kind of spiky and sticks together. And when treated properly, it forms a material, felt, that doesn't come apart. And the beaver felt was especially prized because it was stiff and it would stand up and make a nice hat. But it wasn't just hats, it was everything that we needed felt for. And today we're even, how many of you are wearing wool tonight? There was a time, but it's itchy. So let's go on. Oh, back in the 1670s and 80s, Prince Rupert of the Rhine was riding for the British crown. He was one of those cavaliers you heard of and led some famous charges. Oh, what a hero he was. And afterward, the king rewarded him. He gave him Prince Rupert's land. Today, we know it as all of Canada west of the Great Lakes, all the way to the Pacific. That's what the crown gave him. And out of that, he formed the Hudson Bay Company. That was the other thing Hudson found, was the big bay. So the Hudson Bay Company, and they traded with the Indians for furs. And it was incredibly profitable. Like I said, it drove wars. Canada, by the way, consisted of Upper Canada, Ontario, and Lower Canada, Quebec. And the maritime promises weren't part of it yet. Newfoundland only became part of Canada in, I believe it's 1933. No, go figure. Okay, there was competition in the fur trade, competition like you wouldn't believe. It was bloody competition. Look at the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company. Can you imagine companies that had their own national flags? They had their own armies, their own government, and all their own traders. They ran the place, not Canada. The Northwest Mounted Police don't come into being until the mid-1870s. And they were absolutely ruthless, along with the American Fur Company, which was headed up by John Jacob Astor out of New York. And he worked with the Missouri Company and the Astoria Company out of Oregon, and was in competition with the British right up along the Missouri River, right up near what's now the Canadian border. And they were fighting back and forth. And I'll get my Indians to attack you and attack your Indians and steal their furs and their traps and back and forth. And when white men tried to push up, the Rocky Mountain Company, they were pushed back. The Rocky Mountain Company tried to go up the Missouri and had to give it up. Go. Bill Sublette was born in 1798 in Kentucky. In 1817, he moved to St. Louis, which then was an extremely powerful city. The money from the Santa Fe trade would start coming in through St. Louis. The fur trade worked through St. Louis. This was the western extremis of the United States. His parents died shortly thereafter. He had a number of siblings. 4 brothers went into the fur trade. 2 of them died at it. Eventually, he retired to St. Louis, and as I mentioned earlier, he actually started farming and was appointed to the State Banking Commission and served there for 8 or 10 years. He was also worked stores, and he worked the business end of the fur trade, supplying the guys in the mountains after spending a few years there himself and leading caravans out to the mountains. Came down with tuberculosis, consumption, and that's what killed him in 1845. Only 47 years old. See, I'm really too old to play. So, there we go. But he was with Henry in 23. Andrew Henry led the first group up the Missouri. And he was in partnership with Ashley. And let's go on to the next slide real quick. You know, they asked for enterprising young men who wanted to go up to the mountains for 1, 2, or 3 years there to be engaged with in trading with the Indians. Ashley was lieutenant governor of Missouri, and he was also the general of their militia. Henry was a major, and a bullet maker, which is why the advertisement said, meet him at the lead mines. But what made all this possible? Let's see if I've got it on the next slide. Okay. What made it all possible is that our government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to defend the Indians from unscrupulous fur traders who might give them whiskey in exchange for furs, who might cheat them. Our government, right as soon as we got a constitution, decided that it would take over trading with the Indians. Besides, this was an incredibly profitable business. And so they set up factories, trading posts. And they sent out their own factors, their own agents, who were Indian agents, and they camped all along the edge of Indian country. Basically, they're all along the Mississippi River. And they set up there and waited for the Indians to come to them. Meanwhile, Hudson Bay was going to the Indians with good quality British goods, and they were trading with everyone, and the Indians didn't feel like walking all the way to Missouri, all the way to the factories, and so mostly they didn't. The Indian agents had no incentive to go out to the Indians. They were getting a salary. They got the same salary whether the Indians came to trade or not. And so the government proved to us how you can take the most valuable industry in the country at the time and make it lose money. And finally, in 1822, they realized enough is enough, and they gave it up, and they licensed people to go and trade with the Indians. And Ashley and Henry set out with a trader's license. And they headed up the Missouri. Now, the Missouri is one nasty river. They say of it that it's too thick to drink and too thin to plow. And it's full of floating trees, sawyers, full of shoals. The channel changes constantly. It's so narrow that you're not about to sail up the river. So how are you going to get up the river? Well, you could have guys on the edge of the boat with long poles planted in their shoulder, walking backwards down the edge of the ship, and then running back up to the front to do it again. And you could pole the boat up the river. Or you could use the cordelle. That's basically French for cord. But you couldn't get to the banks very conveniently in most places. So the guys on the cord ended up to their chests in water most of the day, pulling the boat up the river. As it was, Ashley lost one of his two boats. Now, he was taking goods to trade with the Indians. He'd hired 100 men to tow his boats and serve as traders and hunters once they got upriver. And now he'd lost half the trade goods, half the stuff he needed to outfit them. They had problems with finding food. Believe it or not, there were already deserts as far as game was concerned. And a lot of men deserted along the way. When he gets upriver, they've got about 20 guys left. And when a mountain man bragged that he'd been with Henry in 23, he was telling you something. Two kinds of men went up the river. Engages, French word, basically means employee. They were hired. They sold their furs to the company at the price the company set. They bought goods from the company at the price the company set. But they got their whole outfit from the company. And then there were the free trappers. And these were guys that trapped on their own and sold to who they wanted to. And these were the kings of the mountain eventually. A mountain man's kit. Well, a knife. A good butcher knife. And does it say Green River on there? The Green River is supposed to be right there. That's why given to them up to the Green River. The only problem is the Green River didn't start making knives until the Mountain Man era was almost over. But they were real good knives. But they did have knives. And they would have a hatchet or tomahawk. I showed that off earlier. Never runs out of ammunition. A rifle and pistol. That gave you 2 shots. And how many of you know how to load it? Okay. And where'd my powder horn go? Well, there's the powder horn. This one has got something kind of rare on it. That is a 50 grain powder measure. And when you open the gate with your thumb, hold it upside down, 50 grains of powder pours in there. You take and close the gate and then pour it down the barrel. You now reach back into your pouch for a bullet and patch, put them here, and drive them. It's a fight because it's rifled. You drive them down the barrel. And if you're using a cap lock weapon, you now bring the hammer back and reach again for a small cap to place on here. The cap has fulminate of mercury like a match. How many of you took farmer matches when you were a kid and threw them on the pavement? Do you hear them go bang? Yes. Same exact thing. And that's what we were doing here. If you didn't have a cap lock, you had a flintlock, and your final step was pouring powder here, bringing back the frisson. And when the flint struck, it strikes a spark off the frisson and lights the powder, and it goes bang. So if you're aiming, you have to take into account that there's going to be a half-second delay. Anyway, a bullet pouch, flints. I have worked with flints, and you get people who tell you, oh, you can find a flint anywhere, just pick them up off the ground. The best flints came from England and France, and they were factory-shaped. That flint has to be very sharp and just the right shape to fit in there, so it'll shave off a little piece of iron when you fire it. That's your spark. And if it's not sharp and at just the right angle, it doesn't work. So you tell me you're going to do that with a rock off the ground. Not too well. So flints were for sale. Blankets, 1 or 2 episcimores, basically a buffalo robe. You're going to need that in the winter. Traps, 6 or 8 2-pound traps. You're working off horseback. These fold up nicely, but they're bulky, and you've got to carry so many of them. And I'll show you how they're used in a little bit. I won't try and set them. The last time I did, never mind. I like my fingers where they are. A mule, a riding mule and a pack mule with saddles. Sugar, tea. I wonder if I've got my tea. Did we move that somewhere else?
I think we may have moved it. I don't really know where it is.
Tea came in little hard blocks. And you shaved off a little bit when you wanted to do it, and they'd rehydrate into leaves for your tea. I brought along, and you guys can taste this later, I have pinole. And once they got through the Southwest, pinole became something that people would carry. It's made from cornmeal, sugar, cinnamon, and chocolate. And it keeps very well. You can carry it with you. And you mix a little of this in a cup of hot water, and you now have a delicious drink. And it's very nutritious because of the basic ingredient is corn. And atole, A tole is basically cornmeal, and you can use that to thicken your stews. One thing you're not going to see is bread. Castoreum. This comes from the gland of the beaver, and after your first couple of catches, you're probably making your own. And I'll explain how that's used in a minute. A flint and steel kit for making fire, or a kit with a magnifying glass to make fire. A smoking kit, a clay pipe, cigarettes and cigarette papers do not start coming into being until the 80s or 90s. Everybody is smoking a clay pipe. And you know what? These are droppable once. And you go out to old sites and you will find the pieces of them everywhere. And, and a kettle. So let's go on to the next picture. There he is. His luxuries are tobacco, sugar, and tea. Can't carry whiskey, too bulky. And look at how he's protecting his pipe. He's got a piece of rawhide, of thick leather there that is holding his pipe so it won't bend, it won't break the stem. And trade goods. Now, if you were going to trade with the Indians, which is what the license is for, you're going to want wool blankets, horse bells, awls, beads, pistols, and rifles. Yeah, we're selling those to the Indians. It is not considered unscrupulous at all. Selling whiskey is, but everybody does it anyway. But the rifle is a hunting weapon. That thing hits a deer, that deer is going down. The shock of a .50 caliber bullet as opposed to an arrow. The arrow will cause the animal to bleed to death. So you hit him with an arrow and then you can run after him all day until he bleeds to death. Much prefer to have that rifle. For warfare, though, you want the arrow. You got to be proficient with it, and that takes a lot of work. But in the time it takes me to reload that rifle, you can have 5 arrows in the air. And when you hit a guy with that, he starts to bleed. And when he starts to bleed, his buddy has to come over and try and patch him up. And when that happens, you've taken 2 guys out instead of 1. Axes, axes, knives, pots. This is the reason the Indians didn't drive the white man back into the sea. They wanted the trade goods. And they hunted beaver on the East Coast to extinction to get them. Combs. Why do you suppose the Indians wanted combs? For their women. Well, yes. Debbie knows. I told her last night.
Lice or flea, to get rid of lice.
Fine-tooth comb. You comb the lice out of your hair. Whoops. Made it itch, didn't it? Okay. And we can go on to the next one. And there were dangers going up the river. Oh my gosh. Old Ephraim. Old Grizz. The white bear, the plains grizz, is said to have been bigger and a lot more aggressive than the mountain grizzly. He was feared. And why did men fear him? That bear has got a lot of fat. And you shoot him, and the bullet probably doesn't kill him. And now you're spending the next minute reloading while the bear eats you. So what do? Well, after that first shot, you take your knife out. And probably most of you have heard about old Hugh Glass, who went hunting off by himself when he wasn't supposed to on Henry's trip, took off on his own and ran into 2 grizzly cubs. And pretty soon their mother came along and he shot her and really made her mad. And Grizz took a big chunk out of his leg, clawed him open across the stomach, bit him in the head, And then the stories you hear about Jim Bridger left behind to guard him until he died never happened. Henry took him upriver with him, by all accounts. He wasn't left behind to die. They made a movie about that, yeah. And you could have other embarrassing things happen with a bear. I put that in for the kids. There you go. Hunting, like I said, there were places where you're not going to find game. And even where you could, it could be dangerous. And if you couldn't find game, you starved. And this is one of those things that I'm going to have to tell the kids. I said, you're going to run down to the 7-Eleven? You're going to run down to the store? The store is 1,500 miles away in St. Louis. That's the nearest place, or a couple hundred miles to a trading post. You're just not getting there easily, especially in the winter when the snow is that deep and you're going to freeze to death on the way. And you might die of thirst. There are plenty of places where there's no water. You all know buffalo has a hump, right? You know that hump is made up of ribs, and the meat along the ribs, hump ribs, considered a delicacy. You can see a couple of mountain men cooking them around the fire there. You cut that hide down the back and strip it away, and you take the foreleg and cut that off, and you use that as a hammer to break off the ribs so you can cook them. We're going to be up in the mountains above 6,000 feet. It gets cold. And there are no roads. It hasn't been mapped yet. You can get lost. And you can very easily freeze to death. Or you might run into a place that fella Coulter lied about. He came back with the strangest stories, pools of water in all kinds of colors and boiling lakes and steam shooting up 200 feet in the air, and you could take your lunch and put it in the water and cook it right there. Now, who's going to believe anything like it? We told him that's Coulter's hell. You had a dream, buddy, until we got up the Yellowstone and found it. Indians, the Blackfoot, the Ree, the Mandan, were enemies. They were trading with the Hudson Bay Company and with the American Fur Company, with old Astor. And those guys, we're pretty sure, were putting them up to antics, telling them, oh, these mountain men are stealing from you. They're taking your furs. So they'd come along and steal from us. Take a whole season's worth of furs, take your rifle and everything you owned. And sometimes they'd kill folks. And there were other Indians we got along with, the Shoshone and Flatheads and Snakes, Crows. Good folks, helpful, showed us the way. Uninterested in hunting beaver. If you couldn't hunt it from horseback, it wasn't worth hunting. They didn't want to get wet. And so we were happy to work in their country. And we traded with them. In fact, my other pouch has some real old-fashioned trade beads on it. Great big things. And some fellas even took a wife. It was good to have a wife. She could tan skins for you and make you clothes. And she'd bead those clothes real pretty. And that was how she told the other Indians that this is my man and he's wealthy. Look at all them beads. And she could make you a teepee to sleep in and a proper bed. Why, it was good. And she could keep your robe warm in the winter. Yeah. Okay. And then there are the beaver. The beaver, they made dams. They wanted deep water. And that's how they hide from their predators. And again, they have a beaver house either in the middle of the pond or very often on the bank. But the entrance is always under the water level. That's so predators can't get in. And the floor inside is up above water level, and that's where they live. And they store their food just outside. And what do they eat? Willow bark, cottonwood, poplar. And guess what? They all grow around those beaver ponds. So they're kind of a symbiosis. And trapping, what we would do. Old Mr. Beaver is a suspicious fellow. So we put a little castoreum sent from a beaver gland on a stick. And we'd put that somewhere he was likely to pass, and we'd set a trap under the water. And Mr. Beaver'd come along and he'd smell that. And who's this strange beaver in my pond? And he'd go running up to it and step right in the trap. And being a beaver, the first thing he did to protect himself was dive to the bottom. And now he's got a 2-foot trap hanging on his leg, and it's too heavy for him to come up again. And so we capture the beaver with his skin whole, the whole plume. We'd hunt in spring and fall, when the beaver's undercoat is the thickest. Actually, it's thickest in the middle of the winter, but you really don't want to be at 6,000, 10,000 feet in the middle of the winter. You don't really want to be wading in deep water at that time. You want to be hunkered down in your lodge with a winter supply of wood and meat. So if you got a spring hunt and a fall hunt, and you can't go out in the winter, when can you go back to St. Louis to get more supplies? Well, you really can't. So after the first 2 years, Ashley and Henry had it figured out. They would send a supply train. Now, keep in mind, they got driven right off the Missouri. On the Missouri, they could take boats up and carry heavy loads of goods. But the other rivers aren't suitable for that kind of travel. The Platte was the primary river, and the Sweetwater, one of its tributaries. And you'd have water all the way for yourself and your livestock. But there's no road, and no hope of there really being one for a long time. So you're taking a pack train. And so they would bring a pack train up to the mountains every summer. They'd tell everyone where to meet up. There's the Plews, ready for the harvest. And we'd meet at rendezvous. We'd meet in the mountains. And we'd party on down. We would trade for the things we needed, more powder and shot and rifles and knives, and go on ahead. And rendezvous took place for 15 years, 1825 to 1840. 1826, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. That was Bill Sublette and Jedediah Smith and David Jackson. They formed up a company and took over from Ashley and Henry. They would trade in St. Louis with Ashley and Henry, and Bill Sublette would take the pack train back, buy the supplies they needed, and bring it back to the mountains in July. Bring it to rendezvous. They'd tell everybody, meet us over here. We will rendezvous at this point. In 1830, with the trade declining, we sold out to Jim Bridger, Tom Fitzpatrick, Milton Sublette, Bill's younger brother, Henry Frabe, and Jean-Baptiste Gravaille. The company never cleared its debt to Sublette and Jackson, and eventually would be foreclosed. This was perhaps Bill's younger brother made somewhat easier by the fact that both of them knew there was no way that Milton was ever getting out of debt. And Milton decided one year, although under contract to trade with us, to trade with Wythe. Wythe was a kind of Boston wise guy who came out and thought he knew everything and was going to trade in the mountains. and he lasted a couple of years. And the biggest fight ever with the Blackfoot occurred after they'd robbed a couple of mountain men. And then as Milton and Wythe were leaving Rendezvous, they ran into a huge party of Blackfoot. And they sent word back for help, and everybody at Rendezvous came to help. And a bunch of Blackfoot forded up, and a battle went on for a couple of days until some of them got away. The southwest corner of Wyoming, southeast corner of Idaho, northwest corner of Colorado, and the northeast corner of Utah, a very, very small area, all around South Pass. South Pass was something the mountain men found. It's a very gradual pass. You hardly know that you're going up. Rises to a bit over 6,000 feet before dropping down. Turns out to be the way the wagons would eventually cross the mountains. And for us, it was a way to take in the pack trains to supply Rendezvous. So you find that all the rendezvous took place in a relatively small area. And this was also the area where the Indians were friendly. Sir William Stewart came out to the mountains a couple of times, the last time in 1840 for that last rendezvous. And he came out to party. He was a Scots nobleman. And among other things that he brought along with him was a suit of armor. And you can see here the picture of Jim Bridger dressed up in a suit of armor riding around the camp. A good time was definitely had by all. There was wrestling and rifle and pistol competitions, competitions with the knife and the tomahawk, gambling, drinking, and some other things less mentionable. Indians were there in great numbers. The tribes that were friendly with us came to trade. As Bill Sublette saw the trade fading, he decided it'd be a good idea to put a trading post, Fort William, at the mouth of the Laramie River where it enters the Platte. And that was Fort William the first couple of years, and later it became Fort Laramie. It was a trading post, and later it was taken over by the Army. And this was an important stopping point on the overland trails to California and Oregon. Bill Sublette tried the Santa Fe trade in 1932. Took a caravan to Santa Fe, and along with him went his partners, David Jackson and Jedediah Smith. Jed Smith was quite a guy. Carried a Bible and read it every day. Wouldn't drink, wouldn't fool around. Saved his money. Was more interested in exploring and looking for new places where there were beaver, looking for new trails than he was in trapping. Jed went out one day ahead of the wagon train to look for water, and he never returned. When we got to Santa Fe, we found Comanches trying to trade his rifle and knives. And that's how we learned that the Comanche had killed Jed. He took down their leader. And Bill Sublette retired to his farm and to be influential in Missouri banking, and eventually to die of consumption. Keep in mind, he's got one brother who's dying one-legged from a wound from an arrow. And other mountain men, though, they went on to show the topographical engineers where the trails were so they could be mapped. They led people across the mountains. They led the wagon trains. Some of them, like Bridger, established trading posts and went on trading and living with the Indians. Others, like Kit Carson, became an Indian agent and went on to be a Union general in the Civil War, which is pretty good for a fellow who couldn't read and write. Any questions?
There's a sublet cutoff. Is it on the Santa Fe Trail or the Oregon Trail? Does that have anything to do with Bill Sublet?
Absolutely. Bill Sublette found the Sublette cutoff, which is just a shortening of the trail up around South Pass.
Oh, it was the Oregon Trail then?
It's the Oregon-California Trail, because until you get into Idaho, it doesn't divide. Or, well, until you get into a little further on, over South Pass, then you got one branch that goes across Utah and across the California deserts to Los Angeles. And you've got other branches that go to San Francisco, Northern California, and still other branches that head up to the Oregon country.
So did he find it or something? It was different than the standard trail. And was it actually better or shorter?
A little bit shorter, a little bit better chance of grass and water. And that's one of the things with these trails is that you had to have yeah, nothing to worry about except I like leaning on it. You needed grass for your livestock, and you needed water for man and livestock. And you needed firewood. And if you couldn't find firewood, you were probably using buffalo chips, and your dinner going to taste funny. But imagine now a wagon train goes across, and the cattle that went along with the wagon train, you had oxen that pulled the wagons, but you had other cattle that were going along to be milked and to be eaten. And the hogs that you took with you and the chickens probably weren't going to make it to California. They were going to be lunched somewhere along the way. And even the army in the old days, if you can imagine, traveling with a herd of cattle behind them, because that was their commissary. And it was the only way that they could do it. Yeah. And so we have Landers cut off and Sublette cut off. By the way, the name Sublette's all over the place. Sublette County, Sublette's Pass, Sublette's Hole. With 5 of us in the mountains, you might have expected that, but most of them were named for Bill Sublette.
You're saying that the prairie grizzly was it a different species?
And different subspecies, I would think.
Lewis and Clark wrote a lot about meeting that animal for the first time.
Yes.
The stories they report are just incredible about because they didn't know they couldn't kill it. And it would chase them off cliffs, and you guys would go out hunting them. And they would end up having to run to save their life, jump off a huge cliff into a river, and prevent being eaten by this grizzly, which they had never seen.
Right.
But I never thought that the prairie grizzly, that could be a different kind of animal.
Apparently bigger and badder than the mountain grizz.
That's very interesting.
And yeah, most bears, my encounter with a black bear on an archaeological dig, we had a jeepy medium, which is an army tent about the size of this row of chairs. And we had the sides rolled up, summertime, let the air in. It was our classroom, and we were having a class. And I'm sitting way in the back, and I look over to my right, and I'm sitting about where Alona is, and I look, and there's a bear right where John is. And my first thought is, where's my camera? So I'm digging in for the camera, and that's when one of the college students saw the bear and screamed, and the bear took off running. And kind of what I would have expected from a bear, but with a grizzly, well, you know what they say up in the mountains, right? That you want the bear repellent, the pepper spray, and little bells on your clothes, because the ringing noise lets the bears know you're coming and they run away. Unless it's grizzly country. And you can tell you're in grizzly country because the scat has little bells in it and smells like pepper spray. Yes.
One other question. The rendezvous then were really only about 15 years. What were the dynamics that made that no longer feasible? It seemed like it was a good plan. What happened that they quit?
China trade. Believe it or not, and I promised I'd get into some of this, how it wasn't all about hats and changes in men's styles. We got another natural product. How many of you know what silk is made from? The cocoons of moths, okay? And silk became available. And it was cheaper than beaver, and we were running out of beaver anyway, because we'd about trapped them out. And yeah. So all of a sudden, what do you go to? Silk hats.
So two things. First, the beaver became more scarce, and there was an alternative that became fashionable.
Absolutely. Not just fashionable, but it was cheaper and easier to work with.
And the shipping that we were talking about with Father Gray, that's bringing the China goods in?
That is part of what starts the China trade. And he's talking about the Manila Galleon. And July 15th, 5 p.m. local, it'll be on Zoom. An announcement is in the Fremont Street mail you're going to get on Tuesday. And the URL is in there that you can make a reservation to attend that and listen from home. And he'll tell you about it. And when you see the comparison of Chinese and Mexican pottery, of women's styles, and even of what the priests wore, you all of a sudden began to realize the very heavy debt that we owe to the Chinese through that Manila Galleon trade. And then the clipper ships, they went up and traded with Astor in Oregon, and in California for cowhides, and crossed over to China and sold things and bought Chinese goods. They sold a lot of otter fur to the Chinese, and opium, but that's another story. Yeah. Well, I've got Pinole and Atole up here, and things to look at. And I think if we can find a hat, we'll have the drawing.
Thanks, God. Your ticket.